I'm deeply honored to introduce our next panel discussion. Esther Duflo, who, as I mentioned, founded JPOL Global, is going to be leading a discussion with Laura Arnold of Arnold Ventures. Laura is one of the, and the Arnold Ventures has been one of our core supporters, fundamental supporters from the very beginning. They actually didn't even question the name and have been now she's rethinking it, a steadfast partner and both thought partner and thought leader in the work that we and they are trying to do to promote evidence-based policy and a culture of evidence-based policymaking. So I'm delighted to welcome Esther and Laura.
Hello. Hello. Happy birthday to you guys, JPOL North America and friends. Happy birthday to us guys, JPOL Global. From time to time, Amy and I have a meal together or a coffee, and usually she's a little bit jittery because I tend to put some big amount of work on her plate, and so I do remember the coffee we had in now deceased coffee place up the street, where she was kind of talking about these issues of how Oregon was difficult, how can we help people do more, and I was like, consider starting JPOL North America. And I was like, that was an expensive coffee to have.
For some more than for others, Esther.
For some more than others, and in particular for my friends here. So Laura,
see, when you say it, they laugh. That's when you get a Nobel Prize. You get more laughs when you say a line.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. There hasn't been an RCT for that. So I have the privilege today of interviewing Laura. Last time we were on the stage together, she was interviewing me. So that's just a return of a favor. Laura needs no introduction. She, besides the fact that she had the good wherewithal of not discussing the name JPOL, she also runs, along with her husband John, Arnold Venture, who has committed more than $2.5 billion to tackle the greatest challenges in the United States, from healthcare to criminal justice system, and bring to this effort a point of view and a way of doing things that is quite original in the entire philanthropy space, not just in the US, but elsewhere. So let me start with that, maybe the question, which is, how did Arnold Ventures start, and how did it start with this interest in evidence-based policymaking from the get-go?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces and old friends in the crowd, and of course our evidence-based policy team, which is also here from Arnold Ventures, so I'm thrilled to see everyone. And it's always, for a funder, it is always so very rewarding to see a theory be proven to be true, and in fact to be proven more true than one could possibly expect. And so it really is very moving for me and for our team to be here and see the enthusiasm for the evidence-based policy initiatives that are so near and dear to us. And so in any event, thank you for having me, and thank you for that question. I think. We are at Arnold Ventures. We are, as some of you know, we have offices in Houston, in New York, and in Washington D.C. We're a policy-based organization. In terms of our origin story, it started with John and me thinking, how are we going to define the next stage in our lives. We were very fortunate to be in a position to become full-time philanthropists very early in our mid-30s or our early 30s, which really is. It may not feel sort of unusual now because you see a lot of a lot of people in that position. I think what was unusual for us was that we did not have a day job, so we were willing to abandon our for-profit activities and really become full-time philanthropists, which in a sense liberated us to really structure our philanthropy in a way that that would make us more risk tolerant, much less risk averse than many other. That I think many of our peers. And so we created an organization that that tried to mirror our values. And our values are based on understanding what works from an evidence perspective. So we created a filter of thinking through issues that started with identifying a problem in the United States that we thought was a systemic problem that was under-resourced in our view, that was not receiving the attention that we thought it required, where we could identify some sort of market imbalance, whether that was political in nature or economic in nature, systemic in nature, and where we thought philanthropy could create better solutions. But a foundational component of that analysis had to be, what do we know? What do we know about the problem? What do we know to be true? How can we define the problem with a rigorous perspective and get to solutions based on evidence? That was the foundation of what we tried to create. And then, then ideally, we would navigate through the spectrum of creating solutions, proving those solutions, scaling those solutions, and converting them into policy in a streamlined way. So that's our aspiration, is to create an organization that leads with evidence, that leads with an honest discussion of what we do and what we don't know, that leads with humility and understanding that social science deals with humans, and humans are imperfect, unpredictable people, right? We are imperfect and unpredictable, and our behavior is very, very, very difficult to change. And we need to understand that from a policy perspective, and we need to have the sincerity to have the dialogues about what does and doesn't work. Because if we care about solving the nation's biggest problems, if we care about addressing the needs of our most at-risk communities, we have to approach the problems with the sincerity of understanding if something doesn't work. Because what good is it to invest in a program that's innovative if at the end of the day it doesn't work? So that's sort of what defines us and what we try to do.
So these two of the sectors that you've decided to kind of embark on early on and that you still focus on very much are criminal justice and healthcare.
Yes.
And those may not have been the easiest place to lead for any number of reasons, but particular for this idea that, we need to understand what works and what doesn't work, and scale up what doesn't work, and scale down what doesn't work, and scale up what does work, because those are two areas where, which are deeply embroiled with preconceptions, big political entanglement, and so on and so forth. So what's been your experience in making headways with evidence in those particularly challenging areas? Just one of the two or the two?
Yeah, well, those are, to call them challenging is an understatement. As everyone in this room knows, Amy has devoted her life to healthcare. We were just talking about the difficulties in healthcare policy. It is, they're fraught for many reasons. I like to approach each of those issues from the starting premise that we're in this business to help people. So we're in this business to understand how we can create better alternatives. In criminal justice, for example, defining the problem is not hard. I mean, you need only open a newspaper or do a very cursory web search to understand the magnitude and depth of the dysfunction in our criminal justice system. From our community corrections to prisons to racial injustice is manifested in everything from arrest to how we treat people post-conviction, to issues relating to reentry. So there's not, and in healthcare it's the same. I mean, you need not think too hard to understand that our healthcare system is dysfunctional. So defining the problem is not particularly hard. I think that the hard part is approaching the issue with discipline and sincerity and humility to understand what do we know about what could and couldn't work. And so I'll take criminal justice as an example, and I'll take one of our very first forays in criminal justice, which was pretrial risk assessments. Bail reform is now a very, very common subject of discussion in criminal justice circles. Is very controversial. When we started the work in bail reform, which was about, and it was actually pretrial reform, it wasn't related to bail, about 15 years ago, what we were trying to understand is why is it that there were 700,000 people on any given day in jails in this country awaiting trial only because they were not able to make bail. Not because they were dangerous, not because there was any risk of flight, but because they couldn't pay, call it $500, to be released until trial. That seemed suboptimal to us. That seemed like a waste of resources. Should we not think about a way to only incarcerate the risky people until you have your day in court? We do live in a country where you're innocent until proven guilty. That did not seem to us like a cost-effective way to run a government. It did not seem to us like a just way to run a criminal justice system. So we started researching and creating an alternative. That became very controversial for many reasons, and that was our first foray into marrying research and a data-based intervention. And in that case, a data-based intervention was a non-interview pretrial risk assessment tool that would be a resource for judges to assess a defendant based on risk as opposed to based on wealth, which we thought was, it's imperfect, but it's gotta be better than just saying, do you have a bank account? And money is absolutely not a proxy for danger. Maybe, this risk assessment could be a source of discussion, a different data point. Not the only data point, not dispositive, but at least something that would give guidance that was an alternative to a fixed bail schedule. That was our thought. But it's difficult. You're working in a system where the data inputs are imperfect, right? Where the origin of the data has serious biases and serious flaws that might, in the eyes of many, compromise its credibility. That's very difficult. You're testing something that's very, very difficult to test, and so it requires, I need not tell you, it requires constant evaluation, constant iterations, constant touch points. And so what happened, in that case, just as by way of illustration, is that became a very interesting intervention for many jurisdictions that were forward-thinking. But we weren't quite ready from a research perspective to roll out the big answer, right? And so that was the first time for us that we felt the tension between living in the policy space and living in the research space, right? In a perfect world, you don't roll something out until you have concluded an RCT. And we know that RCTs take a very long time. In the policy world, politicians want to do something today. The problem is today, the issues are today. More importantly, to many, the election is tomorrow, right? So I don't know is not a good answer, right? It is not a satisfactory answer in the real world. So our challenge, I think, is marrying those and creating a dialogue that's humble and sincere and saying, this is the best we know. I can tell you for sure that the problem exists. I can tell you for sure that the system is dysfunctional. I can tell you for sure that the existing system is suboptimal and not serving communities. What can I tell you about the answer? Well, I can give you my best thinking. And I can commit to you that through organizations like JPAL and its partners, and through our other research partners, we will research the answer. We will research these interventions, and we'll pivot if we need to. So that's all we can do. as a philanthropy, as a policymaking organization, is to think through those issues in that disciplined way. I didn't talk about healthcare, but I would say that, in healthcare, that I think the approach for us has been somewhat different than what I just described in criminal justice, because a lot of the work that we've done in healthcare is not a randomized controlled trial in nature. That's something that, that experts like Amy do. What we have found most helpful in healthcare was research relating to establishing fundamental truths. So, for example, pharmaceutical pricing, which I would consider one of our greatest successes of late. The issue with pharmaceutical pricing is that people can't afford their drugs, period. The question around pharmaceutical pricing is, why is it that we in the United States pay 3 times more than comparable countries for the same drug? There are some very powerful talking points that we've all heard from the pharmaceutical companies as to why that is. Well, innovation, you can't, cut our pricing, and this is so expensive. This is so expensive. We need to spend top dollar. Otherwise, we're not going to get the most innovative drug. If you go to Canada, you're not going to get the same healthcare, the same access to drugs that you have in the U.S. We're the greatest country in the world, et cetera. You've heard all of those things, right? You've heard all of those arguments. Our job in the healthcare, in pharmaceutical pricing, was to systematically examine those points. Are they true? Is it true that the pharmaceutical companies need to charge these astronomical prices in order to maintain innovation? Well, it turns out it's not true. Not to bury the lead, it's not true, right? The cost of bringing a drug to market is far lower than what pharmaceutical companies say. The amounts of money that pharmaceutical companies spend on R&D is overshadowed by the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies spend on marketing, right, and on advertising. The misconduct, I will call it misconduct, although it's legal, of pharmaceutical companies in creating patent thickets, in creating in taking advantage of the monopoly that we have delivered and that we have provided to pharmaceutical companies to create astronomical prices, was not well understood. So shedding light on what is truth in terms of how much a drug costs relative to how much drugs are, and what is the existing system in the United States that has created those incentives and that ability for pharmaceutical companies to enact abusive pricing that affects us all. That was something that was not well understood. And I think that, in terms of research and data, was our biggest contribution. We funded numerous studies trying to dig at those questions. How much do we, as taxpayers, through the NIH and other federal sources, fund innovation that in turn then benefits pharmaceutical companies once they acquire drugs, for example? What does the patent thicket look like? What is the behavior of pharmaceutical companies that is leading to these price escalations? So those are the kinds of things. Those are the ways in which, at least in pharmaceutical pricing, we've channeled research to just to shed light on the issue and to start the conversation. And at the same time, we do care about alternatives. It's not just about poking at the issue and saying this is a problem, this is a problem. So we do explore alternatives. We explore alternatives. What is an alternative pricing structure? We founded and funded ICER, which dedicates itself to understanding how you can assess the value of a drug and marry a pricing mechanism to the actual value that a drug might create. That's just one example. So we try to also offer some solutions and guide the conversation in ways that are more constructive. But not so much RCTs, more kind of a combination of investigative research and descriptive research and innovative policy solutions.
Just one quick follow-up on this one. So that's not RCT, but still all this data that you kind of accumulated and on the various causal channels behind the increase in drug prices, that all this effort, ultimately, and we have all this effort, and then at the end, you have a huge policy success, which is the IRA, or the part of the IRA that talks about drug prices. That's necessarily a little bit of qualitative statement I'm asking from you, but how much would you say all of this evidence that you were able to marshal, or that researchers were able to marshal with your support, contributed into the IRA being what it is?
I think, well, I like to think enormously, but I do think there are some reasons to think that is the case. Not only did we invest in what I'll call descriptive, broadly, sort of descriptive research and investigative research to shed light on the issue, but we also invested heavily in campaigns to make these points, to rebut the very, very, very active and vocal pharmaceutical lobby on these very points. So some issues, and I should say also that pharma pricing, not unlike every other issue that we deal with, you could see a political window opening when we started the work. You could, we look for issues where we believe that at some point, for some reason, in the near term or in the middle term, Republicans and Democrats will have to agree. Criminal justice, that was the impetus behind all of our criminal justice work 15 years ago, because at the time, many state governments were facing budget constraints. Republicans were coming to the table and were willing to listen to arguments about how to spend less, what way to spend less? Well, how about we reduce jail populations safely? How about we not destroy people's lives and allow them to become members of the community, et cetera? Plus, on the right, there was a sector of the right that was very faith-based and deeply believed in second chances and deeply believed in atonement, and that was we were able to bring those voices to the table in conjunction with people who were more, mainstream Democratic, and create solutions. In the same way, there was already a consensus that pharmaceutical pricing was abusive. There was already a consensus, and there were stories that were becoming more mainstream about people not being able to afford their drugs. We saw that this was a topic of discussion for the left and for the right. And we also saw that if this issue was not addressed in the medium or near term, it would be catastrophic, and Republicans and Democrats knew that. So that was our opportunity. So you're right that we funded a great deal of investigations to rebut the talking points of pharma, and at the same time, we tried to channel that grassroots sentiment. So we funded Patients for Affordable Drugs, which started by an incredible advocate named David Mitchell, who himself is a cancer patient. He was outraged at the hundreds of thousands of dollars that his own treatment to stay alive cost. And he started Patients for Affordable Drugs to start collecting stories and become advocates. So we invested heavily in communications campaigns, in grassroots campaigns. And we saw that political window, and we captured that political window. So the descriptive research would not have been enough had we not had a fulsome and very deliberate communications and policy campaign following it, so that we could get in front of legislators, so that we could get in front of periodicals and write op-eds and have very prominent voices of reason who were impartial say the system is broken, the system doesn't work. This was never the intention. And if it was the intention, there was some misconduct. It's on us as taxpayers and as citizens to create guardrails for a monopoly. Right? It's not the pharmaceutical company's fault. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is maximizing profits for their shareholders. They're doing their job. We're the ones not doing our job.
Let me pivot to RCT for a minute. One of the things that Arnold Venture is very known for besides its propensity to work on easy subjects like criminal justice and healthcare, is something that you also alluded to, which is this the need to have a great humility in looking at the data and in taking conclusions from the data and so on and so forth. And that's something which we as researchers have sometimes difficulty with, because even though we like to have our data as good as possible, we also like to have clear and clean results. And then if we can't, if we can't have clear, clean results, we at least like to kind of let's say, make them look clean and clear. And one of the things that very unusually, I think, very unique among all donors that in the space that Arnold Venture has done is to say, look, you are in this business to find out what the truth is. It doesn't really matter if it's not what we hoped for. And it's not really matter if it's not going to lead to a great publication because it's a zero result. We just really, really, really have to know what is in your data, and including whether it's enough to come to a conclusion either way, and whether we need more, and so on, etc. So that I kind of wanted that's more of a statement and a question, but I just wanted then a question. I just wanted to highlight that because it's been very influential, I think, beyond in the research community, beyond the people that Arnold Ventures has directly funded in creating, in kind of sustaining a culture of seriousness and humility and earnestness in this business, which I'm very obviously very sympathetic with. That statement being, as a background, I'd like to know I'd like you to give us one or two examples of something that you learned that really surprised you, that was against, again, it was different from your intuition going in, and where this approach of, let me, and in particular with an RCT, I have this insight that this could work. Researchers did the research. This is what I learned, and this is how it's different from how I went in, and how it has affected my way of thinking about these problems and others.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a question of culture. Right? Everybody here understands the value of a null finding. And the value of a null finding, I would argue, in many cases, is much higher than the value of a positive finding. That message, when you leave this room and go to what I'll call the real world, that is a very, 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 very tough message. Because, like I said, legislators don't want to hear, I don't know. They don't want to hear, it might work. They don't, what they want to know is, what should I do? I've got this problem, what should I do? And if you're going to be successful from a policy perspective, if you're going to be successful as an advocate, which is part of what we do, not all, you've got to provide some answers, right? And so there's always that tension, right? And we see this very much with studies that we consider that we often do not fund, which are not RCTs, but are proposed to us, but they're imperfect for some reason. Methodologically, not great. It's a really tough issue to study. But it's the best that we can do, right? It's the best that we can do given the realities of what we're trying to study, and the variables, the components, the limitations of dealing with humans, et cetera. So we get these studies, and the research, the person who's advocating for the study says, listen, it's just a really hard area, this is the best that we can do. And we turn those studies down because nobody is going to pay attention to the asterisks that they're going to put, right? And they're like, in the asterisks, they're going to qualify it and say, well, the methodology is not perfect, and this is the best that we can do, and blah, 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 blah. That's getting dropped from any policy discussion. The headline is all that's going to matter. And if the headline that is generated by a study that is imperfect leads someone to believe that something works when we don't know, that is a bad day for all of us. And it's definitely a bad day for Arnold Ventures. But it's a culture question of having that fealty to the pursuit of truth, to the exclusion of something that sounds good right now. You asked for an example, and there are a lot of people here who probably have many more examples. But one that comes to mind that was really near and dear to my heart was Amy's study on the Camden Coalition, which was heartbreaking because first of all, everybody loved this project, right? This is the project where high utilizers in Camden were identified and were given services with the hope that in the end they would have better outcomes because we would identify them. The head of the program was a tremendously, committed, sympathetic, kind, wonderful person, right? I mean, this is Atul Gawande wrote this big thing about, in the New Yorker about him. He was, by the way, probably raking it in terms of philanthropy. He had no reason to test his program. He probably right now would have hundreds of millions of dollars to expand his idea. He had arrived, but he wanted to know whether his program had impact. And sadly, many of us know the results. The program did not show the impacts that we all had hoped, and it was heartbreaking. But his answer, his reaction, at least publicly, when asked about this was, I'm glad I know, right? I'm still committed to the idea, and I'm going to try something else because my commitment isn't to me, and it isn't to that idea, it's to those communities. Who are we helping? If we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to the exclusion of some other program that might be better, if the thing doesn't work. So it is, it can be heartbreaking, but to me, it's about having that humility and that fealty to serving the communities that you're seeking to serve and understanding that we do a great disservice to those same communities if we promote things that have an asterisk next to them.
Do you think, so you're saying, I think rightly, that the real world it's difficult for the real world to think of asterisks. At the same time, if you take, for example, the public reaction to the Camden study, I would qualify as positive in the sense that a lot of the spin on the story was along the line, look, this great guy, he did this thing, it didn't work out, but he admits to it, he's gonna do something else, isn't it good? So in that sense, when another story could have it would just be boring and nobody would have talked about it either way. The Camden story actually generated news for being a zero, which was interesting to me because it's not that frequent. And I wonder whether you see this as the sign of a shift in culture, which would become a little bit more accepting to, okay, many things that are great idea in the first place don't work the way we want. But by showing that they don't work, and showing honestly that they don't work, then we have more trust, right. And people should have more trust in the things that we do say work.
I think in theory that's right. I think in practice the issue is that, as you know, research means very different things to very different people, right? And evidence means different things to different people. From a funder's perspective, I can't tell you how many hockey sticks I see all the time. Some program, and when we started it was 0, and now whatever the thing we're measuring now it's 50. Like some pre-post, whatever. Why? Because now everybody wants to see evidence, right? They don't necessarily want to see good evidence. They just want to see evidence. And there is a plethora of researchers who are willing to do something descriptive, pre-post, not rigorous. Honest, I mean, not, I'm not saying they're being, they're misleading or being nefarious, but not rigorous. To deliver, it's almost like they become like bankers, right? Like if any of you has ever worked in the corporate world, in a merger, there's There's always a fairness opinion that's required from an investment bank, that the merger is fair, right? And it's the big joke is that you just sort of say, well, would you like the answer to be? And you can create the analysis to get to the answer that you want by including or excluding certain components or weighing them differently, sort of the same idea. So I think the challenge, I think in theory, yes, we all want to aspire to a search for truth in decision making and policy making that is married to rigorous research. I think what we need to battle against is the fact that it is so much easier to do something simple and inaccurate. It is so much easier. And so many people in the world that we live in, which is the world of social science and the world of philanthropy and the world of trying to make the world better, people are well-intentioned. They're in this business because they care, because they want to help people. And so they want the thing to work. And I've had many conversations with people who say, listen, I am not the person to work with you because I can't lead with evidence, because I know the problem is wrong and I know what works. I've been in the trenches. I don't need your RCT, all due respect to Esther Duflo, I don't need.
Arnold.
I don't need you to study my thing. I've lived the thing. So get out of the way and just let me work do my thing. And that's a very compelling, argument, right? And so that's what we're fighting against. And so that person who just wants to do her thing, she just wants to fix prisons, right? She just wants to fix community violence. She knows, because she's worked in neighborhoods and she knows how to do this. She just wants money to go do that. She doesn't want money to study it. And if she needs to find some researcher somewhere who's going to justify her thing by doing a quasi-study that in our view would have some flaws, in her view it doesn't have any flaws. And so she ticked the box. She ticked the evidence box because, XYZ Foundation says you've got to have evidence. And so, she'll say, okay, here's my evidence, now give me my. So that's what we're struggling with, is that people want things to work. Legislators want to find solutions. And it's hard to be, they used to call us, maybe they still do, they used to call us the evidence police at Arnold Ventures. We used to have this blog, which we will restart, right? Justin Milner, we're going to restart it, called Straight Talk on Evidence, where whenever a randomized controlled trial would come out, John Barron would do a review of any study, not just random, any sort of meaningful study. And he would assess the methods, and he would give the researcher a chance to respond to any observations, and it was a thing. And so, people started calling it the evidence police. Oh, here we go. But that's, we think that's important.
I'll tell you how we're called. In the US, the randomistes. In France, actually better. So in France, randomize is aléatoire. So that's aléatoire. So in France, we are the aléatolas. So anyways, that's. But I think you are underselling your influence by a margin. So I'll tell you a little bit the way I see this, the evolution of, since I've been in the position of trying to sell this thing for about 20 years now. With one anecdote from about microcredit. So early in the microcredit movement was very much in the position of no need to wreck the boat. It's going very well. Thank you very much. We don't need to evaluate microcredit. And I was trying to evaluate microcredit. So clearly there was very little interest from the activists. When they believed what they were doing, they were getting the money. So why take the risk? Fine, I understand that. I was talking to a very prominent philanthropist at the time. And he was very much into microcredit. And I said, but there is no evidence. At the time, there was no evidence. And his answer was, I don't need evidence. I have anecdotal evidence. This was years before the alternative facts, but it's just of the same level of, really? Is that what you were telling me? That's how you made your money? And this is, I don't think this conversation would be had with this person now.
I agree with that.
I'm sure that maybe they would still not want to fund studies of microcredit or whatever, but they wouldn't just say that. Mm-hmm. And so I had this as a question, but I'm going to again put it as a fact to start with. I think that Arnold Venture, and you in particular, and John Barron and all of your friends, have had an important role in philanthropy, in moving the needle in terms of what's acceptable to say and to support. And it is true that there is a gap between what people say and what they do. So it is true that it's not sufficient to talk about evidence and treatment effect to actually have evidence that we should rely on and treatment effect that we can believe. But I've become more become more of a believer in the power of the right words to actually kind of slowly pigeonhole people into doing the right thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely, and I think that we have really advanced, exponentially. I'd say certainly in the the last 20 years, even the last 10. And we see evidence of this in federal agencies that now have tiered evidence programs. That was not something that was that was commonplace 10 years ago. There is an increased awareness. There are states that are increasingly aware of and willing to create tiered evidence programs and be guided by evidence. Absolutely. I do think we still, despite those victories, which I think are significant and well earned, I do think we all have to stand guard against bad evidence. The philanthropist who made that comment about microfinance, I wonder whether that philanthropist would be satisfied now with something short of a rigorous RCT or something short of what you would be satisfied with, right? I think we have to fight very, very hard against bad research. And I think, we saw this is now probably 8 years ago or so, and I'll just give you a concrete example of how this played out in real life. We became very interested in social impact bonds. I can't remember when this was. This was, I don't know, 8 years ago. And social impact bonds had been moderately successful in the UK. We thought it'd be terrific to bring the idea, the concept to the US. The basic concept being that governments are reluctant to innovate. So if you de-risk the opportunity by having philanthropy absorb the risk and be paid only if something succeeded, then this would be a way, to incentivize governments to take. That was the basic idea. So we structured some of these deals, and initially it was terrific, but we would require a randomized control trial of the intervention that we would fund before we define success, right? Because we didn't care so much about getting money back. We cared about innovating and creating an alternative to something that didn't work, right? So we cared about implementing something better. In practice, what happened was that participants in these deals wanted something short of an RCT. Oh, an RCT takes too long. Oh, an RCT is too expensive, because they are expensive. Let's just do, let's do some pre-post study. Let's do some, surveys or blah, 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 blah. Let's survey people and, hear how they feel. And if they feel good, then, because they wanted the payout, right? They wanted to get paid back. So I think this idea, and so we walked away from social impact bonds because we said this is not in the spirit of who we are. And by the way, you're not helping anybody. You're just shuffling money from one bucket to the next, and you're not, you have no idea whether or not you're impacting anybody. So I do think, although we have come so far, I do think all of us have to stand very, very strong to object when we see a study that is inadequate or that is not conclusive, right? I think there's room for anecdotes, and there is room for observational studies. There is room for surveys. There is room for all of those things. But we need to be clear and call it what it is and not jump to a conclusion that will then become, a policy when we don't know whether something works.
Yeah, I must say that's very much I have very much the same view on social impact bonds, which is it's kind of confusing confusing the issues, and that if you are putting very, very strong incentives to get a particular result, then someone will generate that result somehow. And all of what we were trying against is to create conditions in which whatever your incentives, implicit, explicit, your own desire for a particular result is guarded, is prevented from touching the data. And that's this going in the opposite direction by saying, oh, if only you find that result, there is that for you in store. So that, in a sense, cannot work, and kind of confuses the tool of the use of. It's the same thing that a lot of people, maybe this I would phrase as a question, a lot of people, maybe more in the international development than in the US, I'm not sure, but sometimes come to us and say, oh, great, you're doing a randomized control trial, we can use that for accountability. In a sense of, being like, being the evidence police, like, oh, this, all this money that is being wasted and doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. And to which, so the answer is, we would want to use evidence for accountability, or we want to use the evidence to find out the solution?
Right, right. Yeah, so we, I don't think we're at the point yet where that accountability analysis factors into many of our policy discussions. But I would think that accountability comes from different sort of sources. Please. I agree with you that the threshold question is, do we want to invest in a certain intervention and scale it? And do we think it works? And we're getting ahead of ourselves if we consider anything else before we have the answer to that question.
Maybe that's the right place to stop our bilateral conversation, and because that's a good, it's a very nice kind of conclusion, and to open it up for questions from the audience.
Thanks very much for this informative discussion. I'm Adam Gameron from the William T. Grant Foundation, and long been an admirer of the Arnold Foundation's work. And one of many things I admire is your ability to bring advocacy to support the implications of the research findings. But how do you deal with situations, and I'm going to give an example, but it must not be the only one, where there's an evidence-free backlash to a policy that you're advocating on the basis of evidence? So I'm thinking of bail reform, where there is evidence to support that reform, helps people without threats to public safety, and yet there's been a tremendous backlash in New York City, where I live, and in many other places. How does that call for more research? Is it a call for more advocacy? How do you think about it when there's backlash against what the research you supported shows to be empirically verified?
Thank you for that question, and I'll first say that we were not involved in the passage of the New York legislation. The New York bail bill, in all of its iterations, actually exceeded what we naturally would have advocated for. I think that there is very good research to indicate that in the bail context, that misdemeanor bail reform does not create an environment that threatens public safety. Right? We funded research out of Penn that was high quality and that proved that point. I think in criminal justice in general, the problem is always that the opposition's argument can be made in 10 words or fewer. And our argument requires at least 50 words, if not 100, right? And all that the bail opponents have to do is find one person which is statistically not difficult, who did something bad while out on bail. And then it's almost game over, right? Because then this horrible person, should have been, but the only way to prevent that, logically, the only way to prevent, like that will happen. That happens under the existing bail, it has nothing to do with bail reform. The only way to prevent somebody from doing something bad is to incarcerate that person. So you either incarcerate every single human who comes before a court and is arraigned, or you create some methodology for releasing people who you believe are not risky for whatever reason. That is our view. A fixed bail schedule does not do that. In my view, a fixed bail schedule only answers one question: do you have $500 or not? That's it. So you're right that it is difficult to battle those arguments because those arguments are visceral and they appeal to people's fear. So the way that we've handled those is frankly to be very honest about, and I mean maybe we're not super successful at it, but we're almost technocratic about it, and say like, I understand. By the way, I want to be safe too. I don't want anybody to take my stuff. I don't want anybody to hurt me, right? We all agree that that's what we want. We're not talking about an individual case. We're talking about a policy in light of resource constraints, in light of civil rights, in light of issues of racial equity. We are all trying to create a better society. So how do we do that? And how do we weigh those factors? So what we try to do is we try to deflate some of those arguments by saying they're red herrings. They're not only are they not based on evidence, but they're inaccurate. Because many of those examples in New York, for example, relate to things that have nothing to do with bail reform, right? That person who committed that crime would have committed that crime anyway if he or she had been, subject to a bail schedule, because, organized crime and bad people actually have money. So that's not an empirical statement, but, organized crime can get you out of, if you're a member of an organized crime ring, you have no problem making $500 bail. The person who can't make bail is the person who is impoverished and who is living paycheck to paycheck. And there's no reason to indicate that that person is innately violent. So my answer is we try very hard to counteract those with facts. We don't always succeed because the rhetoric is so inflammatory sometimes. But that's not a reason to not bang the drum on what we know to be true. It is also true, I should say, that one of the issues with bail reform is that the reform community has swung dramatically, in my view, to the left. And that's been problematic because they've advocated for zero restrictions, zero incarceration upon arrest. No questions asked because they don't believe in the risk assessments. And there are reasons to not believe in the risk assessments. Like, I'm not saying that they're perfect. They're not, right? There is a garbage in, garbage out problem. There is an analysis problem. There is some of the data might implicate racial bias. I don't deny any of those things. But the effect of advocating for zero detention has been to really polarize the community and force people who are more centrist to take a side. And people, when forced to take a side, and it's the worst outcome for policymaking, right? Because when that centrist is forced to take a side, what we're seeing is that those centrists are actually heading more to the right than they are to the left, because they don't want zero oversight. They'd rather have more than less, right? So that's what we're seeing, and that's what we're battling. So we're trying to be a centrist, non-ideological voice to advocate for what we do know works. We don't have, for example, a view on felony bail reform. That's not something that we've advocated for more measured bail reform for that very reason.
Maybe we can take at least two questions. So I see Marianne and Matt, and then you can answer in which whatever subset. So.
Thank you. Marianne Bates, J-PAL alum, and now with the state of California. It was really interesting to hear why you were interested in tackling criminal justice and healthcare initially. As you look to the next 10 years, what are some of the most important problems or areas that you'd like to tackle next?
That's good, because I was charged with asking you that question when you get there.
I have a very quick question. I've been a long time admirer of the Arnold support of work
If there is a last question, that might be your last chance.
Oh, this one right there.
Hi, I'm Leonardo. I have two questions. Firstly, thank you so much for all the things that you shared. In regards to evidence-based policymaking, from social enterprise point of view, if people have with goodwill start a social enterprise trying to do good, and they do not have the resources to prove whether their intervention actually works or not, what would you suggest for them before? They want to do good, but they don't have the resources to prove. What should they do then? That's one. Second, from the policymaker perspective, they want to make a policy, but there's no available evidence or research about what they want to do, but something needs to be done. How should they approach this? So it's a similar question from the two different perspectives that I hope you would suggest based on your experience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll try to take some of those.
Yeah, don't forget the challenges, but
Yes,
other than that, feel
I'll
free
conclude.
to.
Yes, I'll conclude with the new with the new challenges, but I'll address some of these. Thank you so much. The way at least we approach the work is when we identify a problem. When we identify a problem, we define the problem, and then we ask the next question we ask is, what do we know? What do we know, and what would we need to know in order to create a better solution? It seems to me that if you're starting a social venture, that analysis would also be adequate. What are you trying to solve and why? And what makes you think the thing you want to pursue works? So now, it could very well be that it's an area that's wholly untested. There are some, but I would venture to think that there's some scholarship or something in the area that social entrepreneur is seeking to address. So I think approaching it from an evidence-based perspective from the outset, and maybe the answer, the short-term answer is we want to try an entirely different approach to K-12 education or to whatever that actually has not been tested. We love trying things, right? We at Arnold Ventures, we think, so it's not that we will only invest in things that are proven. It's that we're not going to call things proven if they're not proven, right? We're willing to try. If there is indicative evidence that something has a likelihood or a possibility of working, that's a different category that is worth pursuing, but that isn't. Our hang-up is we just don't want you to say that it's called evidence, right? That it's evidence-based if it's not evidence-based. So I think that the thought process is very similar in that regard. You also asked about values, what I'll call values-based policymaking, which I think is very important. Things like the death penalty, abortion, public defense. At least that's what my takeaway from your question. There are some things that are wrong with the world that are not subject to evidence analysis. They're value questions, and we personally at Arnold Ventures do not engage in those because I don't believe I can move you, and I don't believe it's my place to move you in terms of values. So regardless of my view about the 6-week abortion ban in Florida, which for the record I think is atrocious, I don't believe it is a fruitful exercise for me to try to convince you otherwise. So that's not an opportunity for bipartisan collaboration. So for me, that's not something that I would do at Arnold Ventures. I may do something personally, but I wouldn't do it at Arnold Ventures. There are some areas, I mentioned public defense, where the question doesn't need research. Public defenders, it's a Sixth Amendment right. We're not satisfying our Sixth Amendment right. There's not enough resources. Public defenders are overworked. That's the issue. So the answer is more money. We could do research on how do we get more money, what are better financing structures to fund governments to satisfy that obligation. But at its core, it's a constitutional right. And it's not driven by evidence. But we don't do a whole lot of those because they don't really fit within our model. But they're important to do. And I think that that's one of the beauties of philanthropy and of social entrepreneurship in this country is that we all get to choose our lane. And the fact that there's another lane doesn't mean that I don't value it. It's just, it's not the lane I've chosen. Replication, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. We were seed funders very proudly of the Center for Open Science, which really sparked a movement for replication and pre-registration and just research integrity in general. That's something that you'll see a whole lot more of at Arnold Ventures under Justin Milner, who's here, and his terrific team. Shrutika's here. That is something that is near and dear to us for many reasons. But again, it is a significant part of our effort to elevate the quality of research and to and to live in a world where we all can rely on the research studies that are published. We had a lot of problems in our first iteration trying to address the incentive structures that lead people to behave in ways that are suboptimal. We don't have great answers to that, but stay tuned. Hopefully we'll. That is in the works. I'm not sure we can address the fundamental incentive structure in academia. Maybe I'll leave it to the academics, but we can certainly exert pressure. And I'll end with your excellent question about new frontiers. So in addition to healthcare and criminal justice, we have a very fulsome portfolio in democracy. We've been one of the top, if not the top funders of ranked choice voting in this country at the state level of gerrymandering, anti-gerrymandering laws, et cetera. We have a large journalism portfolio. We believe journalism is part of our democracy portfolio, so that's something that we feel very deeply about. Tax policy, public finance. So we have a lot of additional areas. Some of the newer ones that I'll highlight is our work on infrastructure. I think that's our biggest, probably our largest new development of late. We will have significant. We will have a significant push for infrastructure reform in this country, both housing, which is mostly at the state level, not exclusively, but mostly, transportation and climate. That research will, of course, play a very large factor in that. Those are more policy plays also of, getting permitting reform passed at the federal level, engaging in some of these climate, some of these issues at the federal level that are barriers to establishing the infrastructure for climate change that we need in order to satisfy our goals. So that would be the one. Affordable housing is something that is sort of within infrastructure and also outside of it, but that's also an area that we'll see a lot more of. And I mentioned that we don't play in the abortion space. We are very, very active where we do believe there's a bipartisan opportunity, which is contraceptives. And that work, for reasons that are positive and negative, is actually ramping up because that's where the opportunity is, especially given the restrictions on abortion that we're seeing nationwide. So that work will scale significantly, I would predict, in the next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Session, but I think I want still us to stay with the one feeling that there has been a lot of progress in the relying on evidence in the philanthropy and in policy, pushing the needle in policy as well. But we still have to guard against bad research. And with your help and support, we are hoping to continue to do that in JPAL North America and JPAL Wild. And we are very, we are thankful for your effort in continuing to do it across all of your portfolio in the sectors where you're working and in the new sectors that you highlighted now, which are as important as ever. So thank you so much for this fabulous discussion.
Well, thank you. And really, it's an honor to be with all of you. And there are no words to describe how proud we are of the accomplishments of JPAL North America under Amy. It's really, not only are you a pillar grantee, but you are the thought leaders. And it is your impact transcends the slides that you presented. Your impact is incredible. So we are so very proud to be supporters. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Esther, for that fantastic discussion.